The snow fell softly on Christmas Eve, 1998, blanketing the quiet suburban street in Milton, Massachusetts, in a pristine white that seemed almost too perfect, too pure for what was about to unfold. Robert Carson stood in his driveway at 3:15 in the afternoon, his breath forming small clouds in the December air as he loaded the last suitcase into the trunk of their silver Honda Accord. His 11-year-old son, Tommy, was already buckled into the back seat, his face pressed against the window, watching the snowflakes accumulate on the glass with the kind of wonder that only children possess. The boy's new Game Boy sat on his lap, a Christmas present from his grandmother that had arrived early, and he clutched it like a treasure, eager to play Pokemon Red during the flight to Fort Lauderdale. Sarah Carson stood in the doorway of their home, wrapped in a thick cardigan, watching her husband move with his characteristic efficiency. Robert was always methodical, always prepared, the kind of man who triple-checked everything and arrived everywhere 15 minutes early. It was one of the things she'd loved about him when they met 14 years ago, his steadiness, his reliability, the way he made her feel safe in a world that often felt chaotic. But that afternoon, standing in the cold watching him pack their car for what should have been a simple trip to visit his mother for the holidays, Sarah felt something she couldn't quite name. An unease that settled in her chest like a stone. She would later tell investigators that she'd felt at the moment she woke that morning. A premonition, perhaps, or just the natural anxiety of a mother watching her family prepare for travel. Either way, she couldn't shake it. Robert closed the trunk with a solid thunk and turned to her with that patient, loving smile that had won her heart all those years ago. "Got the tickets right here," he said, patting his briefcase. "Tommy's motion sickness medication, the phone number for your mother, our boarding passes, everything. We'll be fine, Sarah. It's just a quick drive to Logan, then we're Florida bound." He walked toward her, his shoes crunching in the light snow, and pulled her into an embrace. She held him longer than usual, breathing in the scent of his cologne, memorizing the feel of his arms around her. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. "We'll call you from the gate. We'll be back before you know it, and you can enjoy a week of peace and quiet without us making a mess." Sarah laughed despite the heaviness in her chest and walked to the car to say goodbye to Tommy. The boy rolled down his window, his face flushed with excitement. "Mom, Grandma said there's a pool at her community center. A heated pool. Can you believe it? In December." Sarah reached through the window and ruffled his dark hair, so like his father's. "Be good for Grandma, okay? Don't stay up too late playing that Game Boy, and make sure you call me every day." Tommy nodded enthusiastically, already distracted by the device in his hands. "I will, Mom. I promise. Love you." Robert started the engine, the Honda's familiar rumble filling the quiet street. Sarah stepped back as they pulled out of the driveway, watching as Robert waved through the driver's side window and Tommy's small hand shot out of the back window in an enthusiastic goodbye. The silver Accord turned left onto Pinewood Drive, its taillights disappearing around the corner, and Sarah stood there in the snow, watching the empty street long after they were gone. That was 3:47 p.m. on December 24th, 1998. Robert and Tommy Carson were heading to Logan International Airport for a 7:15 p.m. flight to Fort Lauderdale, a 45-minute drive they'd made dozens of times before. They had plenty of time. They had everything they needed. They should have arrived at the airport by 4:30, checked in by 5 o'clock, and been sitting at the gate by 6 o'clock, calling Sarah to let her know they'd arrived safely. But they never made that call. They never checked in for their flight. They never arrived at the airport. The silver Honda Accord vanished completely, as if it had driven off the edge of the earth, taking Robert and Tommy with it. And for 26 years, their disappearance would remain one of Massachusetts' most baffling unsolved cases, a mystery that consumed Sarah Carson's life, that turned her from a vibrant 40-year-old woman into a haunted ghost who spent more than 2 decades searching for answers that seemed impossible to find. Until November 2024, when a construction crew in western Massachusetts, digging 15 feet below an abandoned rest area, unearthed something that would finally reveal the truth. What they found buried in concrete would shatter everything Sarah believed about that Christmas Eve. It would expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of local government. And it would reveal a horror so profound, so calculated and cruel, that even hardened investigators would struggle to comprehend how human beings could be capable of such evil. If you're fascinated by true crime mysteries and unsolved cases that finally find resolution, subscribe to Ultimate Crime Stories to stay updated on cases like this one. The truth is often darker than we imagine, and some secrets fight hard to stay buried. When Robert and Tommy didn't call from the gate that evening, Sarah assumed a delay. Boston traffic could be unpredictable, especially on Christmas Eve, and maybe they'd hit unexpected congestion. By 8 p.m., when the flight had already departed and she still hadn't heard from them, she called Robert's cell phone. It rang and rang, going eventually to voicemail. She left a message, trying to keep the worry out of her voice. "Hey, it's me. Just wondering if you made the flight or if you had to catch a later one. Call me when you get this." By 9 p.m., when there was still no response, Sarah called the airline. The customer service representative checked the passenger manifest and delivered news that made Sarah's blood run cold. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but Robert and Tommy Carson never checked in for Flight 447 to Fort Lauderdale. They weren't on the plane." Sarah felt the room tilt. "That's impossible. They left here at 3:45. They had plenty of time. Check again." The representative checked again. No record of them checking in. No record of them at the gate. Nothing. At 10:30 p.m. on Christmas Eve, Sarah Carson called the Milton Police Department and filed a missing persons report. The responding officer, a young patrolman named Kevin Brennan, took down all the information with growing concern. Two people, a father and his 11-year-old son, had simply vanished between their home in Milton and Logan Airport. Officer Brennan immediately contacted the Massachusetts State Police, who issued a BOLO alert for the silver Honda Accord. Every patrol car in the state was given the license plate number, the description, the urgency of finding this vehicle. By midnight, as families across Massachusetts were celebrating Christmas Eve, wrapping presents and sipping hot chocolate, Sarah Carson sat alone in her living room, staring at the phone, willing it to ring. Christmas morning arrived with no news. Tommy's presents sat under the tree, untouched. His stocking hung from the mantel, still empty. Sarah called her mother-in-law in Florida, had to tell her that Robert and Tommy had never arrived. Listened to the older woman's confusion and fear. "What do you mean they didn't arrive? Where are they? Where could they be?" Sarah had no answers. No one did. The days that followed were a blur of police interviews, search efforts, and mounting dread. The Massachusetts State Police organized a massive search operation. They checked every hospital between Milton and Logan Airport. They reviewed footage from traffic cameras along the most likely routes. They checked toll booth records, gas station surveillance, anything that might show where the silver Honda had gone. Nothing. Not a single sighting. Not a single clue. The car had simply vanished. Investigators interviewed Sarah extensively. They looked into Robert's background, his work, his finances, searching for any reason he might have voluntarily disappeared. What they found was a man who seemed to have no reason whatsoever to abandon his life. Robert Carson was a 41-year-old civil engineer who worked for the Massachusetts Department of Transportation. He'd held the same job for 12 years, was well-liked by colleagues, had a spotless professional record. Financially, the Carsons were stable middle class, no significant debts beyond their mortgage. Robert had no criminal record, no known enemies, no history of mental health issues. Friends and family described him as devoted to Sarah and Tommy, a loving father and faithful husband. The idea that he would simply drive away from his life made no sense. Theories emerged and were quickly discarded. Had they been in an accident somewhere off the main roads? Search teams combed the areas along possible routes, looking for signs of a vehicle leaving the roadway. They found nothing. Had they been carjacked? It seemed unlikely in broad daylight, and there had been no reports of similar crimes in the area. Had Robert, for some unknown reason, changed his mind about the trip? But the airline tickets were non-refundable, and Robert was known for being responsible with money. He wouldn't have just not shown up. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the case began to go cold. The media coverage that had been intense in those first weeks gradually faded. Other stories took priority. Other tragedies demanded attention. By March 1999, the Carson case was just one more unsolved disappearance in a state that saw its share of missing persons every year. But Sarah refused to let it die. She hired private investigators. She organized search parties. She created missing persons posters and distributed them across the state. She appeared on local news programs, pleading for information. If anyone saw a silver Honda Accord on Christmas Eve, if anyone remembers seeing a man and a young boy, please come forward. Please help me find my family. Years passed. In 2005, 7 years after their disappearance, Robert Carson was declared legally dead. It was a legal necessity, allowing Sarah to settle his estate, to access his life insurance, to move forward in the practical ways that grief demands. But Sarah never truly believed he was dead. Or rather, she couldn't allow herself to believe it, because belief meant giving up hope, and hope was all she had left. Tommy's room remained unchanged. His Spider-Man posters still hung on the walls. His bed was still made with the same Star Wars comforter. His Game Boy games were still stacked on his desk, waiting for him to come home and play them. Sarah couldn't bring herself to pack any of it away. Every year on Tommy's birthday, she would buy him a present, something age-appropriate for the young man he would have been, and add it to the growing collection in his closet. By 2010, Tommy would have been 23 years old. By 2015, he would have been 28. By 2020, he would have been 33. Sarah aged with the years, her dark hair turning gray, the lines deepening on her face, but a part of her remained frozen on December 24th, 1998, waiting for her husband and son to come home. The case remained officially open but inactive. Detective Kevin Brennan, who'd taken that first missing persons report, had long since retired. The Massachusetts State Police Cold Case Unit reviewed the file periodically, but with no new evidence, there was nothing to pursue. Then came November 2024. The old rest area on Interstate 90, about 30 miles west of Boston in the town of Framingham, had been closed since 2005. It had been a small facility, just a parking area with restrooms and vending machines, the kind of place travelers used for quick stops before continuing their journeys. But years of deferred maintenance and declining usage had led the state to close it permanently, fencing it off and forgetting about it. In 2024, the state finally decided to demolish the old rest area and sell the land for commercial development. A construction company called Bayside Development won the contract. On November 18, 2024, their crew arrived with excavators and bulldozers to begin site preparation. The plan was to dig down 15 feet to create a stable foundation for the new structure. The crew foreman, a man named Steve Kowalski, who'd been in construction for 30 years, was operating the excavator when his bucket hit something that shouldn't have been there. At first, he thought it was bedrock, some natural formation that would require blasting. But when he cleared away more soil, he realized it was concrete. Man-made concrete, and a lot of it. Steve climbed down from his excavator and examined the site more closely. What he'd uncovered wasn't a natural formation or even some forgotten infrastructure. It was a concrete chamber approximately 10 feet by 8 feet by 6 feet, buried 15 feet underground. The concrete was professional grade, reinforced with rebar, the kind of construction that required expertise and planning. Steve had been in the business long enough to know that people didn't bury concrete chambers this deep without a reason. And that reason was rarely good. He called his supervisor, who called the site manager, who called the state inspector, who called the Massachusetts State Police. Within 2 hours, the construction site had been transformed into a crime scene. Yellow tape cordoned off the area. Forensic teams arrived with ground-penetrating radar and excavation tools. And Detective Maria Vasquez of the Massachusetts State Police Cold Case Unit stood at the edge of the pit, looking down at the concrete chamber, feeling the kind of dread that comes when you know you're about to uncover something terrible. The excavation was careful and methodical. This wasn't a construction project anymore. It was an archaeological dig, a process of uncovering evidence that had been deliberately hidden for decades. It took 2 days to carefully break through the concrete and expose what lay inside. When they finally breached the chamber, the smell that emerged was the dusty, stale odor of long-sealed spaces. And inside, they found a vehicle, a silver 1998 Honda Accord, its paint dulled by years of darkness, its windows intact but covered in a film of dust and mineral deposits. The license plate matched immediately in the state database. This was Robert Carson's car, the car that had vanished on Christmas Eve 1998, the car that had been the subject of one of the most extensive searches in Massachusetts history. It had been here all along, buried 15 feet underground in concrete, less than 5 miles from where Robert and Tommy were last known to have been. Detective Vasquez stood there for a long moment, staring at the vehicle, her mind racing. Someone had done this. Someone had taken a car with 2 people inside, driven it to this rest area, excavated a massive hole, placed the vehicle inside, and poured a concrete tomb around it. This wasn't a random crime. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. This was premeditated, calculated, and expensive. This was murder. The next question was the one that made Vasquez's stomach turn. Were Robert and Tommy Carson inside that car? The forensic team began their careful work, documenting everything before opening the vehicle. They photographed the exterior from every angle. They took samples of the concrete, looking for any trace evidence. Finally, they were ready to open the trunk. Vasquez stood back with her partner, Detective James Park, as the forensic technician carefully pried open the trunk lid. It resisted at first, the seal having set over more than 2 decades, but eventually it gave way with a groan of protesting metal. Inside, wrapped in deteriorated blankets, were 2 sets of skeletal remains. 1 adult, 1 child. The remains had been preserved to a degree by the sealed environment of the concrete chamber, protected from the elements and scavengers that would normally scatter and destroy evidence. But there was no doubt what Vasquez was looking at. These were human remains. And based on the size differential, based on the location, based on every piece of circumstantial evidence, these were Robert and Tommy Carson. Vasquez had been a detective for 15 years. She'd worked dozens of homicides, seen the worst that human beings could do to each other. But standing there looking at those remains, knowing that an 11-year-old child had been entombed in concrete for 26 years while his mother searched desperately for him, she felt a rage build inside her that she had to carefully control. Professional detachment was essential in this work, but some cases made detachment impossible. This was one of them. The remains were carefully removed and transported to the state medical examiner's office. The car itself was loaded onto a flatbed truck and taken to a secure evidence facility. Every inch of that concrete chamber was photographed, measured, and sampled. And then came the hardest part of Detective Vasquez's job. She had to call Sarah Carson and tell her that after 26 years, her family had been found. Sarah was now 66 years old, living alone in the same house in Milton where she'd watched Robert and Tommy drive away on that snowy Christmas Eve so many years ago. She'd retired from her job as a teacher 5 years earlier, unable to maintain the energy and focus that working with children required when her own child had been stolen from her. Her days were quiet now, filled with routines that kept her occupied but never quite kept her from thinking about them. She volunteered at a local animal shelter. She took long walks. She maintained Tommy's room like a shrine. And every December 24th, She stood in her driveway at 3:47 p.m. and remembered when her phone rang on the afternoon of November 20th, 2024, and she saw it was from the Massachusetts State Police. Her first thought was that it was another in a long series of dead ends. Over the years, she'd received dozens of these calls. Someone thought they'd seen something. Someone had a theory. Someone wanted to help, but ultimately had nothing to offer. She answered with the weary resignation of someone who'd learned not to hope too much. Mrs. Carson? This is Detective Maria Vasquez with the State Police Cold Case Unit. I need you to come to our office in Framingham as soon as possible. We found something related to your husband and son's case. The drive from Milton to Framingham took Sarah 40 minutes, during which her mind cycled through every possibility. What could they have found after all this time? A witness who'd finally decided to come forward? Some piece of evidence that had been overlooked? She tried to prepare herself for disappointment, but there had been something in Detective Vasquez's voice, something heavy and final, that made her think this time might be different. When she arrived at the state police barracks, she was escorted to a conference room where two detectives waited. Detective Vasquez was a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and a gentle manner that immediately put Sarah on edge. In her experience, detectives only looked at you with that much sympathy when they were about to deliver devastating news. The other detective, an older man with gray hair and a weathered face, introduced himself as James Park. They asked Sarah to sit down. Vasquez poured her a glass of water, and then they told her. 2 days ago, a construction crew had been excavating an old rest area on Interstate 90. They discovered a vehicle buried in concrete 15 feet underground. The vehicle was a silver 1998 Honda Accord with license, plates matching the car Robert had been driving on Christmas Eve 1998. Inside the vehicle, in the trunk, they'd found skeletal remains. 2 sets. 1 adult male, 1 juvenile male. Preliminary examination suggested the remains had been there since the time of the disappearance. DNA testing was underway, but based on the evidence, they were confident these were the remains of Robert and Tommy Carson. Sarah heard the words, understood them individually, but couldn't quite make them form a coherent meaning in her mind. Found. Buried. Concrete. Remains. They're dead, she heard herself say, her voice sounding distant and strange. They've been dead this whole time. Vasquez reached across the table, her hand stopping just short of touching Sarah's. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Carson. I know this isn't the outcome you'd hoped for. Sarah laughed, a sound that came out harsh and broken. Hoped for? I spent 26 years hoping they were alive somewhere. Hoping they'd been kidnapped, but were okay. Hoping they'd wake up one day with amnesia and remember who they were and come home. I spent 26 years in hell, not knowing. And you're telling me they were buried 15 feet underground 5 miles from where they vanished? They were there the whole time. Detective Park spoke quietly. Mrs. Carson, I need you to understand something. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a case of your husband losing control of the vehicle or having a medical emergency. Someone did this deliberately. The concrete chamber was professionally constructed. This was planned, executed, and covered up. Your husband and son were murdered, and someone went to extraordinary lengths to make sure they were never found. The word murdered hung in the air like poison. Sarah had known, on some level, that if Robert and Tommy were found dead, it would likely be because someone had killed them. People didn't just vanish into thin air. But hearing it confirmed, hearing that her family had been victims of calculated violence, was different from knowing it abstractly. How did they die? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Vasquez glanced at Park, then back at Sarah. The medical examiner is still conducting the full autopsy, but preliminary findings show blunt force trauma to both victims. Mrs. Carson, I need to prepare you for something difficult. Based on the forensic analysis, your husband appears to have died very quickly, probably at or near the time of their abduction. But your son, the evidence suggests he may have survived for several days after your husband's death." The room spun. Sarah gripped the edge of the table, feeling like she might faint. What are you saying? Tommy was alive? For how long?" Vasquez's expression was filled with a pain that mirrored Sarah's own. "We found evidence that suggests he was kept somewhere, possibly drugged based on some preliminary toxicology. The medical examiner estimates he survived between 3 and 7 days after the initial abduction. Mrs. Carson, I know this is almost impossible to hear, but we need you to know everything. Your son didn't die on Christmas Eve. He died several days later." Sarah couldn't breathe. The air seemed to have been sucked out of the room. Tommy had been alive. For days after Robert died, Tommy had been alive somewhere, terrified, alone, waiting for help that never came. While Sarah had been filing missing persons reports and calling hospitals and organizing searches, her baby had been out there somewhere, still breathing, still hoping his mother would find him. And she hadn't. She'd failed him. For 3 to 7 days, Tommy had been alive, and she hadn't found him. And then he died without her, without anyone who loved him, probably scared and in pain and wondering why no one was coming to save him. The detectives gave Sarah time to process, to cry, to rage. They brought her tissues and water and sat with her in her grief. Finally, when she could speak again, Sarah asked the question that would drive everything that followed. Who did this? Who killed my family? And Vasquez gave her the only honest answer she could. We don't know yet. But I promise you, Mrs. Carson, we're going to find out. This is now an active double homicide investigation, and we have resources and technology that didn't exist in 1998. Someone buried your family in concrete thinking they'd never be found. They were wrong, and now we're going to make sure they pay for what they did. Over the next several days, as Sarah tried to process the reality that her 26-year wait was finally over and the truth was so much worse than she'd imagined, the investigation moved forward with renewed intensity. The medical examiner's office confirmed through DNA analysis that the remains were indeed those of Robert and Tommy Carson. The cause of death for Robert was determined to be a single catastrophic blow to the back of the skull, likely from a heavy object like a pipe or a bat. Death would have been nearly instantaneous. For Tommy, the findings were more disturbing. Multiple injuries consistent with restraints on his wrists and ankles. Evidence of sedatives in preserved tissue samples. And finally, blunt force trauma to the head that had killed him. But the timeline of that trauma, based on decomposition patterns and other forensic markers, placed it at least 3 days after Robert's death, possibly as many as 7. Detective Vasquez stood in the medical examiner's office, looking at the evidence laid out before her, and felt a cold fury settle in her chest. Whoever had done this had killed Robert quickly, probably to eliminate him as a threat or a witness. But they'd kept Tommy alive. An 11-year-old child had been held prisoner for up to a week, drugged to keep him compliant, before finally being murdered and stuffed into a trunk with his father's corpse. The cruelty of it was staggering. The planning required was even more disturbing. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was calculated murder, followed by an elaborate disposal designed to ensure the bodies were never found. The concrete chamber alone would have cost thousands of dollars and required heavy equipment and expertise. This was someone with resources, with connections, with the ability to make 2 people disappear and stay disappeared for more than 2 decades. Vasquez returned to the original case file from 1998, reading through every witness statement, every lead that had been pursued, every dead end that had been reached. The lead detective in 1998 had been a man named Raymond Walsh, who'd retired in 2003 and died in 2016. His investigation had been thorough on paper, but Vasquez noticed something interesting. Multiple witness reports had placed a silver Honda near the old rest area on Interstate 90 on the evening of December 24, 1998. The exact rest area where the car had been found buried. But according to Walsh's notes, The rest area had been searched and nothing had been found. Vasquez pulled the detailed search logs and felt her instincts sharpen. The rest area had been searched, but only superficially. A patrol officer had driven through the parking lot, looked around, and reported nothing suspicious. There had been no extensive search, no excavation, no forensic examination. Why? The rest area had been specifically mentioned in multiple witness reports, yet it had been dismissed quickly and never followed up on. Vasquez found one witness report that was particularly compelling. A woman named Patricia Delgado had called the tip line on January 3, 1999, to report that she'd been driving on Interstate 90 around 4:30 p.m. on Christmas Eve. She'd seen a silver Honda pulled over near the rest area with a dark SUV parked behind it. There had been two men talking to the driver, and one of the men had his hand on a young boy's shoulder in what Patricia described as a controlling grip. Patricia had driven past, and by the time she'd thought to call the police, she'd convinced herself she was overreacting. But when she saw the news about the missing father and son, she'd called in her sighting. According to the case file, Detective Walsh had contacted Patricia, thanked her for the information, and told her the rest area had been checked thoroughly and nothing had been found. But that wasn't true. The rest area hadn't been checked thoroughly. It had barely been checked at all. Vasquez picked up her phone and called the number listed for Patricia Delgado in the 1999 report. It rang 4 times before a woman's voice answered. "Hello, Ms. Delgado? This is Detective Maria Vasquez with the Massachusetts State Police. I'm calling about a tip you called in back in January 1999 regarding a silver Honda you saw on Christmas Eve 1998. There was a long pause. Then, oh my God, you found them, didn't you? I saw it on the news. That rest area. That's where I saw them. I knew it. I knew something was wrong that day, and I drove right past them." Patricia agreed to come to the station to give a new statement. When she arrived, she was a woman in her late 60s, well-dressed and composed, but clearly carrying guilt she'd held onto for 26 years. She sat across from Vasquez and Park and told her story again, this time with more detail. She'd been driving home from visiting family in Albany. Traffic had been light on Christmas Eve, most people already at their destinations. As she passed the rest area, she saw a silver Honda in the parking lot with a dark green SUV behind it. 2 men were standing by the Honda, talking to someone in the driver's seat. One man was tall, well-built, with dark hair. The other was shorter, stockier. The tall man had his hand on the shoulder of a boy who was standing very still next to the car. Patricia remembered thinking the boy looked scared, frozen, but she'd convinced herself she was imagining things. By the time she'd driven past, she was already having second thoughts. Should she turn around? Should she call the police? But it was Christmas Eve, and maybe she was being paranoid. Maybe it was just a family having car trouble, and someone had stopped to help. She'd driven on, and the guilt had started immediately. When I called Detective Walsh in January and told him what I'd seen, he said they'd already searched the rest area and found nothing. He said I shouldn't worry, that it probably wasn't connected to the missing family. But I never forgot that boy's face. The fear in his eyes. I knew something was wrong, and I didn't do enough. Vasquez showed Patricia some photographs. "Can you identify the type of SUV you saw?" Patricia studied the images and pointed to one. That one. Or very similar. A Chevy Suburban, dark green or black, late 90s model. And it had a dent in the rear bumper. I remember that specifically because I noticed it as I passed. Vasquez made notes, her mind already working through the implications. A dark green Suburban with a distinctive dent. That was something concrete, something they could trace. She thanked Patricia and assured her that her information was valuable, that she'd done the right thing by calling in 1999, even if the investigation at the time hadn't followed up properly. After Patricia left, Vasquez turned to Park. Walsh buried this lead. He had a credible witness, placing a vehicle matching the Carson's description at the exact location where we found the bodies, and he dismissed it. Park nodded grimly. Either he was incompetent or he was dirty. Let's find out which. They requested Detective Raymond Walsh's financial records from 1998 and 1999. What they found was illuminating. Walsh had been a career detective with the Massachusetts State Police. 25 years on the job, solid record. Nothing in his background to suggest corruption. But in early 1999, Walsh's finances showed some interesting anomalies. In January 1999, 2 weeks after the Carson case had gone cold, Walsh deposited $25,000 in cash into his personal savings account. The deposit slip noted only personal funds. In March 1999, another $10,000 cash deposit. Walsh's salary at the time was approximately $65,000 per year. These cash deposits represented more than half his annual salary, and there was no explanation for where the money had come from. But what really caught Vasquez's attention was a check Walsh had written in February 1999. It was made out to a company called Granite State Construction for $8,000. The memo line read, "Consultation Services." Vasquez looked up Granite State Construction and found it was a concrete and excavation company based in Framingham, Massachusetts, the same town where the rest area was located. The company was still in operation, though under different ownership now. The original owner, according to business records, had been a man named Vincent Russo. Vincent Russo was now 68 years old, still running Granite State Construction from a small office in an industrial park. When Vasquez and Park showed up unannounced, Russo took one look at their badges and seemed to age 10 years in an instant. "I wondered when someone would finally come asking," he said quietly, gesturing for them to come inside. His office was cluttered with blueprints and building permits, the workspace of a man who'd spent his life in construction. He offered them coffee, which they declined, and then sat behind his desk with the air of a man who'd been carrying a terrible weight for far too long. "You're here about the rest area, about what I did there in 1998. I've been waiting for this conversation for 26 years. Vasquez leaned forward. "Tell us what happened, Mr. Russo." "All of it." Russo took a deep breath. December 26, 1998, 2 days after Christmas. "I got a call from a detective named Raymond Walsh. I didn't know him personally, but he identified himself as a state police detective and said he needed a favor. He said it was a private matter, something that needed to be handled off the books, no paperwork, no records. He offered me $8,000 cash for what he called a consultation job. That was a lot of money in 1998. My business was struggling. I'd just gone through a divorce, and I was behind on payments for my equipment. I needed that money badly." "What exactly did Walsh ask you to do?" Vasquez pressed. Russo's hands trembled slightly as he spoke. He said he needed concrete work done at the old rest area off I-90. Specifically, he needed a chamber poured around something that would be placed in a pre-excavated hole. He was very clear that I wasn't to ask questions, wasn't to look at what was being buried, wasn't to tell anyone about the job. He said it was sensitive police business, and if I kept my mouth shut, the $8,000 was mine. If I talked, there would be consequences. Park's voice was hard. "And you agreed to this without asking what you were burying?" Russo looked down at his hands. "I knew it was wrong. I knew no legitimate police work would be done this way. But I told myself it wasn't my business. Maybe it was evidence from a case. Maybe it was something seized that needed to be disposed of. I convinced myself of a lot of things to justify taking that money." He continued his story. On December 27th and 28th, Russo had worked at the rest area. The hole had already been excavated when he arrived, a pit approximately 12 feet deep, 10 feet wide, and 8 feet long. Next to the hole, covered with a tarp, was something large and rectangular. Russo had been instructed not to look under the tarp. His job was to build the formwork, place the rebar, and pour the concrete around whatever was under that tarp. He'd worked quickly, professionally, completing the job in 2 days. The concrete had been poured in stages, creating a chamber that would essentially entomb whatever was inside. It was quality work, the kind that would last for decades. Which, of course, it had. When the job was finished, Walsh had met him at the site, inspected the work, and handed him an envelope with $8,000 in cash. He told me to forget this ever happened. Told me if anyone ever asked, I'd never been here, never worked for him, never seen him before. I took the money and walked away. Russo's voice cracked. When I saw the news about the missing father and son, when I heard they'd vanished on Christmas Eve near Framingham, I started to suspect. But I didn't know for sure. And I was afraid. Afraid of what would happen if I admitted I'd helped bury evidence. Afraid of going to prison. Afraid of losing my business. So I kept quiet. I've kept quiet for 26 years, knowing I might have buried 2 innocent people. Knowing that if I just had the courage to speak up, their family would have known what happened to them. The guilt has eaten at me every single day. Vasquez felt disgust, but also a grim satisfaction. They now had direct evidence that Detective Raymond Walsh had paid for professional concrete work at the exact site where the bodies were found, within days of the Carson disappearance. This wasn't circumstantial anymore. This was proof of a cover-up. Proof that someone with authority and resources had orchestrated the concealment of a double murder. But Walsh was dead. He couldn't be prosecuted, couldn't be questioned, which meant they needed to find out who Walsh had been working for, who had paid him to bury the evidence. Park asked the crucial question. Mr. Russo, did you ever see anyone else at the site? Did Walsh mention who he was working for? Russo shook his head. I only ever dealt with Walsh, but I got the impression he wasn't the one calling the shots. The way he talked, the way he handled things, it felt like he was taking orders from someone else. Someone with money and power. Someone who could make him risk his career to cover up a crime. After securing Russo's full statement and warning him not to leave the state, Vasquez and Park returned to their office. They now had a clear picture of how the bodies had been concealed, but they still didn't know who had killed Robert and Tommy Carson or why. The answer to that question lay in Robert Carson's life, in his work, in something he'd known or done that made him a target. Vasquez called Sarah Carson and asked her to come back to the station. When Sarah arrived, she looked exhausted, hollowed out by grief and the horrifying revelations of the past few days. But there was also a hardness in her eyes now, a determination. She wanted answers. She wanted justice. And she was willing to do whatever it took to help find them.